If you're looking for how to learn a new language fast, chances are your emotions are getting yanked around. On the one hand, you're filled with tremendous excitement. You can almost taste the triumph as fluent sentences pour from your mouth. On the other hand, you've heard that your target language is really hard, and you're worried about memorizing thousands of words and the billions of potential sentences you'll need to master. Let's put a stop to all those worries right now so we can focus on the excitement. And how are we going to do that? With a small set of practical strategies. And let's amplify the wonder, excitement, and truly miraculous experiences you can expect by treating the language learning journey for what it should be. A journey, not a destination. This mindset is really important because not one amongst us is truly fluent in our mother tongue. It's not even a remote possibility when you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, if English is your mother tongue. Yet, when you set proper goals based on luck, the fastest way to learn a language can be yours. So what is luck? It stands for learn using correct knowledge, and that's exactly what you'll get in this video. So even if you find the best language learning teacher on the planet for your target language, they can only take you so far. You have to be able to teach yourself too. And to do that, you'll want to learn the meta-learning skills that make learning a language possible. And these can be broken down into what I like to call the big five of language learning. These 5 elements are based on a scientific principle called the levels of processing, and they are what you need to combine memory, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. It's not a question of which one is most important. It's the holistic combination of all of them that matters in the end. And you can get great writing practice at the same time that you speak by repeating what you put on the page verbally, either before or after putting it down on paper. But it's not the same as speaking with language learning partners, but writing and speaking are very, very important. So you want to double down on those sorts of things, and you want to read as much as you can. And there are many, many ways to find resources that we'll talk about in a minute that will help you read more frequently and more often. Now, of course, more practically, as if those things weren't practical, they're very, very practical. But let's just say more practically, you want to also choose the best possible language learning materials. And this step is tricky, but it's very doable. First, you just have to accept that some risk is going to be involved. You might end up buying a book or course that just doesn't suit you. Now, personally, I treat it all as research and don't get emotionally involved. In fact, I allow myself to be open to revisiting any resource I purchased in the past again in the future, because we as humans can be tremendously fickle. It might not be that the book or course was bad. It's entirely possible that we were either not ready for it yet, or we were just having a bad day, a bad week, a bad month, or a bad year. So we can be more generous to ourselves and perhaps go back to the things that we already have before trying to get the next new shiny object, as if that was going to help any better than what was already sitting there in our closet. Now, a subset of choosing the best materials for learning a language is to limit the amount of sources. So let's say you've got a closet full of stuff that you haven't gone through appropriately enough. Well, rather than dig them all out, go in and just dig one out. When learning a language, we want tons of input, but that doesn't mean that you want it from tons of sources. So I would suggest you take a tip that I've benefited from Ollie Richards from StoryLearning.com. And he has advised at a certain time that, pick at maximum one book, one video or audio program, and one teacher. And by doing this, we give ourselves ample opportunity to experience the levels of processing effect that I talked about before without overwhelming ourselves with endless possible materials that we could be using. So embracing limits helps us maximize our investment in the materials and enjoy the benefits of thoroughness, but also the psychological benefits of being a thorough learner. So my personal rule of thumb is to stick with something for at least 90 days. And this is what I did when I was first exposing myself to many of the languages that I've learned, and just sit there with one thing for 90 days without the shiny new textbooks in my path and really milk them for all that they're worth. It's very, very valuable. Now, I'm a bit biased in this regard, but I'm going to suggest it anyway. Some people object that adding mnemonics for language learning only adds one more thing that they have to learn, and I understand the objection. But ultimately, it's illogical. It's kind of like saying learning to write the alphabet adds just one more thing to the goal of writing words and sentences. Or it's like saying you have to learn how to build airplanes before you build an airport. Okay, it kind of makes sense. It's an objection, but it's not a valid objection. Listen, I'm aware of the Achilles heel of my own teaching. Learning mnemonics can feel like having to build an airport before you can fly and land a plane. But the rewards are worth it, and just as profound as the miracle of international travel. We all know that having airports is worth it. It's not only the funnest way to get from one place to another, but it's also one of the fastest and the safest. And in reality, learning to use memory techniques for language learning is one of the best ways to rapidly accelerate your practice, at least for many of us. And yes, you will hear from some people like Steve Kaufman who says, I never memorize vocabulary and you don't have to. And he's not necessarily wrong for him, but for some of us, including myself, when I had to learn German in a hurry with a deadline to give a talk auf Deutsch from memory, his advice of just listening and getting in enough so-called sensible input, which is an important concept, it couldn't have ever possibly worked. There simply was no time. So mnemonics helps people because the memory palace technique allows you to rapidly scale the number of words and phrases you can remember if you're willing to build the airport. And you use effective association through multisensory, what's called visualization, but doesn't necessarily involve pictures, in order to make words and meanings incredibly sticky. And it's just wonderful if you're into that kind of thing, which some of us really are into it. In fact, the memory palace technique and other memory techniques, they help you optimize how you practice using information, period, in a way that strengthens your overall memory. Now, when it comes to sensible input, put it in the context of strategic challenges. So in the beginning, you might not understand anything. That means it's not sensible input. But as you learn, your pattern recognition will go up, and there are a number of ways to make sure that you're increasing and scaling your sensible input, and these include meeting regularly with a native speaker. And make sure that you're doing things in a way that makes sense to you and experimenting with different things. But one thing that works for a lot of people is to use a picture-based approach. So you bring a magazine and you learn to ask, what is that? And you just keep pointing at the pictures. And it's true, if you just keep doing that enough and you have enough repetition of that, you will just learn that vocabulary without needing to use mnemonics. But I love to just learn with the mnemonics as quickly as possible. And one way that you can do this to maximize the benefit of these sessions where you're just like, what is that? What is that? What is that? Is to record the sessions with your phone and then listen back later and use the mnemonics later if you're not good at using them in real time. And even if you are good at using them in real time, you don't necessarily want to use them in real time because you want to pay attention and get that exposure. And one thing you can do when you listen back to that recording is just have the audio only and try to guess what you were looking at in the magazine to help with this active recall where you're really trying to get it back, which strengthens your memory in and of itself. And of course, there's different ways to mix and match this, and sometimes you can use the mnemonics in real time, other times you don't, etc. This is your journey. Play around with it. Experiment. And you can extend this to movies, you can extend it to with your reading, all kinds of things. The point is to do it experimentally and then figure out what is sensory input for you and then run various experiments of doing it. And when it comes to reading and whatnot, you can just start by getting very, very interested in creating your own translations as you go. My friend Luca, who's been on my podcast a few times and we've had many, many wonderful conversations about this, he has a kind of translation method that he loves to use to increase your fluency, and you got to ask him more about it. But at the end of the day, a lot of it has to do with being super interested in what it is that you are using as the sensible input that you're then going to use to translate and build from. And that can be hard for people. But for myself, like in German, for example, I was very, very interested in music, and I just found interviews with musicians, and it was just so much fun to work with. And they said the craziest things that were the kinds of things that I thought was really exciting and amazing, and it opened up the language for me. So there's no secret formula. There's no secret sauce on exactly how to do that other than experiment and know thyself and come to know thyself through experimentation. And you've got to invest enough time in order to run the experiments, and you want to have some kind of practice that involves daily exposure. But people think that you have to learn 5-6 hours a day in order to pick up fluency in a language, and this just isn't true. By the same token, you're probably not going to get that far with just 5 minutes a day. That said, if you're strategic about it, you can learn a lot in blocks of 15 to 30 minutes. And the trick is to break up the activities so that you're doing different things. So if you had the big five, for example, you could work out a schedule like 15 minutes with vocabulary in the morning, 15 minutes reading in the afternoon, and maybe 15 minutes watching a movie at night. Now, obviously more is going to have a different effect than less, but this is a great way to get a habit and a routine started and start to develop more and more phrases and vocabulary that you might want to memorize if you're going to use mnemonics to do it. And you can also think of patterns like memorize this evening and then review what you memorized first thing in the morning using a journal that you keep beside your bed. The trick is not to get frustrated if you forget things, especially those of you using memory techniques. You want to allow yourself to see things kind of like painting in layers. And sometimes that first layer, it evaporates. And then you go back and you look and you go, oh, now I remember what those images were. And then you have an opportunity to say, now I know how I'm going to improve those images so that they stick better. Many people ask me, how long does it take to learn a new language? And I believe the answer should be that the journey never ends. And it is an interesting question, but it's not one that necessarily has an answer because I don't think that fluency is something that one achieves. It's rather a journey, even in your mother tongue. But for those who are in a hurry, they often come across the idea of frequency lists, and these are compilations of words that are used most often in any given language according to whoever came up with the frequency list. And you know, if you're learning a language, they can be very, very seductive, and they can also be useful. But in some cases, how useful they will be really depends on the strategy of how you're using. And they're almost always incredibly limited because no matter who makes those lists, they do not know your context, right? And they don't know where you're going to find yourself talking about whatever it is you want to talk about. That's why I like Luca's idea of translation, and it has helped me. You know, when you're reading news stories and translating them, it's important to focus on information that's interesting and relevant to you. So if the news story has no interest or relevance to you, what does it matter if it's filled with the words that are most frequently used? It doesn't really matter at the end of the day because you're going to pick them up eventually anyway. And if you can just focus on a blending of word frequency and information that is useful to you, then you're going to move along so much faster. And if you get curious, well, what is it that I want to be able to say? What is it that I need to be able to say? Then you skip this idea of the right words to focus on, and something much more like fluency comes a lot faster because you're able to accomplish missions because you're paying attention to what it is that you want to say and then you need to say, and then you add that in. So get involved. And yes, frequency lists have their place. But so too does the list that you build for yourself, multiple lists. So get building them and start working on them. You know, it's all too easy to get hung up on the little things when learning languages. And some of us become perfectionists without realizing that we need to let go of all that in order to truly learn. So develop the ability to laugh at yourself. And if you struggle with self-criticism or receiving criticism from others, you might want to go watch my TEDx talk, 2 easily remembered questions that silence negative thoughts. I've learned these questions in both English and Sanskrit, and they have been tremendously useful in both of those languages. And here's another thing. Here's the flip side of the coin. Don't be afraid to give criticism. So for example, if you're working with a language learning teacher and they're frustrating you all the time by correcting you too often, ask them to scale it down. Say, listen, we're going to work here for 3 hours or 2 hours or half an hour or whatever. I want you to correct me a maximum of 3 times in this period. And then the next time you can correct me some more. I'll go back and listen to the recording, and maybe you can listen to the recording too. And if you want to have 20 corrections, that's great. You can do that from the recording. I will appreciate it. But while we're here together, 3 corrections, please, maximum. And this is really, really, really important. When I used to submit writing to language teachers while I'm learning languages, I asked them, please point out just 3 errors. I don't want to be overwhelmed with every possible error. I want to keep things light, I want to keep them fun, and I want to keep them focused on the biggest aspects to improve without overwhelm. This is just logic. When you're using logic to solve problems, you try to find the biggest wins that are going to lead to the biggest benefits as quickly as possible. Put it another way. Learning from, hanging around people who suck the fun out of things is an error. And speaking of errors, it would be a grave error not to thank our channel members and everybody who has one of my books and courses, and I really appreciate your support of this work. In fact, everyone on Team Magnetic appreciates it more than words can express. And you know, one of the ways that we've been able to do this work for so long comes down to focus on multiple things at the same time. But in order to learn languages and even to do the work that I do, I had to initially focus on just one thing. To be able to have a blog and a podcast and a YouTube channel and to learn how to learn a language. It's the same for learning anything, is to master one thing. So if you're struggling with language learning as such, add another language after you've earned a decent amount of skill in the first one. I mean, it's normal to want to be a polyglot or someone who speaks 3 to 5 languages, but as far as I can tell, all the successful polyglots got there by being willing to establish mastery in just one language, you know? And once you've done that, you will be very well versed in the meta learning skills that will help you proceed in leaps and bounds towards substantial speaking and understanding abilities in the next one and the next one and the next one. And I'm not saying you can't learn 2 languages at the same time. I will talk about that in a future video. But you can really do so many cool things once you have that first foundation laid. For example, my friend Benny Lewis has a thing he calls laddering, which I've used quite a bit. It's a technique when you pick up a textbook or course in a language you've already learned to start covering the next one. So for example, when I started with Mandarin, my Chinese first exposure was in a book written in German. I love laddering, and I'm so glad that I stuck with German long enough to enjoy great confidence speaking it so that I could actually pick up a Mandarin book in German and ladder in that sense. It's just beautiful. So really consider mastering one thing before moving on. At the end of the day, the old saying that the hunter who chases 2 rabbits rarely catches either stands up here. Split your attention between more than one language at great risk. Now, I've been lucky and was able to spend years of my life in Germany, and during that time I made sure to live with people who spoke little or no English to make total immersion, something from which I could not escape. But I didn't have the luxury of living in China when I first started learning that language, and it was absolutely not necessary. In fact, after less than 3 months of studying the language, my time in the country was so distracting I didn't have time to study it while I was there at all, or very little. And that is typically what happens when you try to combine tourism with immersion. So instead, use these tips that we've talked about today to create some effective systems that will place you in the company of your target language each and every week, or at least a great percentage of it. Then when you do get to travel, you can relax and focus on speaking and understanding as you move around. And you'll have earned that rather than trying to interrupt your time there by learning all the time. So a lot of people think, that kids have some special advantage when it comes to learning a language, and this couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, kids take years to speak proper sentences and many more years to read and write at a sophisticated level. But because adults have all kinds of skills in their mother language, impulse control, and the levels of discipline needed to make it in the job market, we as adults have a distinct advantage. You really just need to bring everything you already know about being a mature and responsible adult to the process of learning a language. But you don't want to sacrifice the childlike curiosity and fun that you can bring to the game. And the benefits of speaking a language are so immense, ranging from higher salary to the brain health benefits of bilingualism. So what do you say? What language do you want to learn? And are you feeling empowered now that you have these tips for learning it? And as you consider your answer and pop it into the discussion below, remember, there's a detailed tutorial-style interview with my friend Luca to go deeper into his best tactics for creating your perfect strategy and systems for language learning. Go ahead and watch that video next. And with repeated thanks, until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.